The Soviet family. Well, the Soviet family emerged. Okay, so coming out of the Russian Revolution, right? You had the Bolsheviks, which were, the leaders of the Bolsheviks were people from middle class, wealthier backgrounds. You know, uh, Lenin, Litvinov, who else? I mean Trotsky, Bukharin, Zinoviev. These were people that were from like middle class backgrounds, had levels of education, and become Marxists, and were very very liberal in their social views. Right? There was a lot of they were for sexual freedom, for example. And their views were probably, compared to most people in Western Europe and in the United States, even at that time, were very, very liberal, right? You have Alexandria Kollontai. You have talk of abolishing marriage. At one point, there was the glass of water theory, that in a socialist society, having sex will be as meaningless as drinking a glass of water, which Lenin opposed. So there was this very, very socially liberal wing that just wanted complete social freedom, right? That was for, just lifting all restrictions on sexuality, lifting all obligation, right? And they took power, right, as the Bolshevik Party. But you have to remember who brought them to power. It was the Russian working class, but also the Russian peasantry, right? And Russia was a majority peasant country at that time. And the Russian peasantry were some of the most conservative people in the world at that time, right? The Russian peasantry were deeply, deeply religious, deeply, deeply traditional. And they had some of the most conservative views about family and sexuality and marriage and tradition of anyone in the world. I mean, thousands of years you'd had the Russian Tsar, the Russian Orthodox Church, and they had the most conservative views you can possibly imagine. So it was this weird contradiction. On the one hand, you had the most far left, liberal, socially liberal, views, and on the other, you had the most conservative. And it was a problem. And the way that during the Russian Civil War, posters were put up everywhere saying the Bolsheviks want to socialize wives and children. There was a huge effort by the counter-revolutionary forces to try and play up the idea the Bolsheviks were all a bunch of sexual perverts or whatever, and they were going to tear apart the family, and that was a big thing. So the rise of Stalin, right? After the death of Lenin, you have the left opposition of Trotsky, and the rise of Stalin, it was, in a way, it was what you could call a synthesis between these two extremes, right? You had two trends that really saw things differently. You had Alexandria Kollontai and the most Bolshevik leaders, which were very, very liberal. And you had Russian peasants that were very, very conservative. And Stalin created a synthesis that worked, which was called the Soviet family. And that synthesis that stabilized Russian society, it was like a compromise, right? On the one hand, women got education just like men. Women worked in factories alongside men. Women became electrical engineers. Women took leading roles. Women were in the military, right? I mean, huge advances were made for women, right? This idea that women shouldn't work outside the home, should just be homemakers, property of their husbands, gotten rid of. But at the same time, right? They did downplay any idea, this idea that the family is a patriarchal institution. Oh, no. They glorified the Soviet family. They had posters. We believe in the Soviet family. Mother, father, kids. Number one. What else did they do? They outlawed abortion. They said we need to populate the country. We need more people in order to build socialism. And they argued, I don't agree with them. I think abortion should be legal and it's up to a woman whether she has one or not. But they argued during the 1930s that abortion was unnecessary in the Soviet Union because guaranteed health care and education was guaranteed by the state. So they outlawed abortion. They also outlawed homosexuality. They said homosexuality, was problematic. It was bourgeois or something like that. So you had a compromise. The Soviet family of the Stalin era was a compromise, and it was kind of a merger between the most far left liberal forces and the most conservative forces, and Stalin was a synthesis. And it worked. It worked, right? The Russian peasantry could agree to it. A lot of Russian Women, who had come from families that were literate for generations, became engineers and scientists and did amazing things. At the same time, abortion was outlawed. In fact, they gave medals to women who had more than 10 children. It was complicated. I'm not saying it was right or wrong. I'm saying it was what worked in that moment. If the Bolsheviks had continued with the more Trotskyite, ideas, and if Alexandra Kollontai's ideas had continued to coexist, it's very likely that the Bolshevik Party and the Communist Party would have been overthrown. And that's how politics tends to work. It's not about simply, you don't get a blank piece of paper when you have a revolution, right? Socialists don't come to power, have a blank piece of paper, they can just write whatever they want on it. It doesn't work that way, right? You have people that have all the baggage, all the history from the old system. They have their beliefs. And if socialists are going to maintain power, they need to empower those people, and they need to maintain the support of those people. So it's complicated. And I'm going to be widely attacked for saying this, like I always am. This drives people crazy when I point this out. I'm just supposed to say Stalin was evil, Stalin was homophobic, Stalin outlawed abortion, he was evil. It's not that simple, folks, right? It's not that simple, right? You can't just declare things from above and expect that. It was complicated, right? And what Trotsky called the Thermidor in the family, the Soviet family, was at that time a great advance in terms of human rights for women in Russia, but it was also a step back from what the Bolsheviks had implemented in the first years of the Russian Revolution. That's just the reality of the situation. And many writers agree, both pro-Stalin and pro-Trotsky writers confirm that basically this was what would work in Russia in the 1930s, and it worked very well. Now, what's interesting is in the 1960s, abortion was widely practiced in the Soviet Union, widely practiced. And so that ban on abortion, that lasted not very long. I think after the Second World War in like the 1950s, especially in the 60s, abortion became extremely common in the Soviet Union. So it's complicated, but that's what the Soviet family was about. And it was a compromise, and it worked. And that this is how politics works in the real world, right? Take it or leave it.